Yeah, okay, you look like a gymnast.
Take off your boots.
Yeah. Boy, I slept good.
Yeah. Coming back.
Okay.
The door open. Close.
Yeah, leave it a little open. Okay.
You understand?
They're not doing anything.
Oh, I hear voices, I just don't know anything else.
So.
So we're very loud. So for everyone who's joining us on Zoom, I apologize. We're having a little bit of a technical difficulty for in-house, but we are working on it and we will be starting very, very shortly. For those of you on Zoom, thank you for joining us. Yeah, okay.
Yes. I've muted it now. It asked me to unmute, but I've now muted it and it sounds much better. Yes, but I'm gonna lower it for Judy.
Okay, can we start? Okay, we would like to welcome everyone. Okay, can we get back to me? You don't need to see me. For those of you in person and for those of you on Zoom, I would like to welcome you to our third Sinai and Synapses program. Sinai and Synapses is a project through fall, and the idea is to bridge science and religious worlds so that we're scientifically grounded and spiritually uplifted. We are all working together to seek answers, and Sinai and Synapses is hoping to show you that working together is a good thing, that science and religion are not in opposition of each other. This morning's program is going to start in just a minute, but before I get to it, I want to tell you about our next program. On May 7th at 7 p.m, Dr. Liad Mudrik from the Liad Mudrik Laboratory at Tel Aviv University is going to be joining us in person here at the synagogue and on Zoom to talk about what we know about neuroscience and free will. And that should be a really interesting talk. There will be a very nice reception following. For today's presentation, if you have questions and you're in Zoom land, if you put them in the chat, we will ask them. And for those of you here in person, we can chat. We will just ask your questions here. And afterwards, there's going to be an informal discussion with Dr. Garroway in the social hall. So that's where we are this morning. So I would like to introduce Dr. Kristi Garroway, who is now a professor of Bible at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. She has a background in archaeology and ancient Near Eastern history. She is the author of Children in the Ancient Near Eastern Household, and growing up in ancient Israel, children in material culture and biblical text. And her writing won the Biblical Archaeology Society's award for best book related to the Hebrew Bible. So we are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Garroway speaking with us this morning. Kristi, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for joining. I hope everybody has a handout because I'm going to be asking for some audience participation. So we're going to get started here. As you can see, the opening slide, I am at the Hebrew Union College, which is the seminary that trains Reform rabbis. We have various campuses, but I am on the LA campus. At HUC, JIR, I teach Hebrew Bible and archaeology. Oops. Okay. So our question that we're going to ask for today, our overarching question is, how can archaeology illuminate the Bible? Right. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through all of these different questions. Now, because this series of talks that we're participating in here at the synagogue has to do with science, I thought I would start out with a more science-y picture here. So does anybody know what this is, or has anybody, maybe we have some students here, have you done an experiment like this? Does this look familiar? No? What's that? Sound does not travel in a vacuum, exactly. So this is the bell jar experiment. And as you can see here, the one on, let me see, does my little mouse move around? Fantastic. The one where it says sound is heard, the cork is out, so it's not a total vacuum. And where the cork goes further in, less sound is heard. And when it's totally sealed off, you don't hear any sound with the bell ringing. So now how does that relate to Hebrew Bible and archaeology? Well, when we think about our biblical texts, we need to keep in mind that they were not written in a vacuum, which means that the surrounding cultures had a great impact on the way that our texts were formed. And you see this quote here at the top by my colleague, Dr. Christopher B. Hayes. It says, "The scriptures are exceedingly respiratory. They breathe in the culture of their times and breathe it back out in a different form." So we might imagine then that the scribes who were writing the texts of the Hebrew Bible were influenced by places like Mesopotamia and Egypt and Turkey and Syria and all the different surrounding cultures as they were writing. So what we're going to look at today is how those surrounding cultures and the different things that were found in the surrounding cultures might help us understand texts that are removed geographically, temporally, and spatially from our own contemporary culture. We're going to be looking at these texts here that I have up, and these are the texts that you have on your handout if you're in person with me. If you're not in person and you're in the Zoom world, don't worry, they will appear on the screen as well. So the first area that we're going to look at is food preparation. And this is also where we need our first volunteer. So would anybody like to volunteer to read very loudly? What's that? Oh, you can come, you even get to come up here. Genesis 18, 1 through 8. Volunteer.
One of the kids, come on up.
Sadie, come on up.
And then we're having trouble getting you in up at the same time, so
Oh.
we're going to go back and forth.
Okay.
So just signal her when you want to go back to the PowerPoint.
Okay.
And can we put Sadie on?
The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. "Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and then go on your way. Now that you have come to your servant, Very well. They answered, do as you say. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. Quick, he said, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread. Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf, and gave it to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree.
Yeah. So what we have here is Abraham preparing a meal for some guests. As we know from ethnography, which looks at cultures that are very similar to ancient cultures, hospitality was a key attribute. And we can see Abraham here, not knowing the people who are coming to his tent, but offering that hospitality. And he says, let me give you something to eat. So the first thing that we're going to look at here is what it means to bake bread. And what you see here in this picture is a group of women in Jerusalem in the early 1900s, and they are sitting on the ground and they are preparing to bake bread. They have a bunch of flour over here, and they have these 2 grinding stones that they're using to grind the coarse flour into a finer flour so that they could make bread. So when he tells Sarah, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread, we have to think about the fact that this was not something that just happened immediately. Sarah had to go and she had to get the bread, or she had to get the flour, she had to grind it, and she had to make the bread. And the kind of bread that they were making was probably similar to what we might call a pancake today, something very quick where you put ingredients together and put it on a hot surface and then cook it. So what did these different things look like that they would have been using to grind bread? Well, I already mentioned the 2 millstones. Those were like 2 giant flat stones that you would grind the bread between. But then once it got ground once, you would need to grind it again to get it even finer. And these pictures here show you some basalt grinding implements. So if you've ever used a mortar and pestle, that was a popular item. This is the pestle, and that's the mortar area. They would also use giant grinding stones. So a stone maybe this long that had a little trough in it, and you would take like a rolling pin back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until you were able to get really fine bread. Now, if you give me a minute here to find my quote. Okay. So the quote that I'm about to read comes from Carol Myers, Rediscovering Eve, Ancient Israelite Women in Context.
Can you stop sharing your screen so people can see you and go back and forth?
Oh, okay. Okay, so the quote says, the laborious process was probably the most time-consuming part of a woman's workload. It has been calculated that it took about an hour to prepare 1 3/4 pounds of flour. So if any of you are bakers, I know during quarantine, a lot of people started baking bread. Just imagine that you had to bake your own bread, but also grind your own flour. It says that the average adult in a mid-20th century Palestinian village consumed up to 2 pounds of bread daily, and bread was sometimes the only meal. 2 adults and 4 children would require about 4 pounds of flour. So it would have taken 2 or more hours a day to prepare sufficient flour. So imagine waking up in the morning and spending 2 hours a day to grind that flour so that it was ready to make bread. I have to go back to the PowerPoint now. Is the PowerPoint showing up now? Okay. Yeah, it's gonna do that. I guess I'll just go through it like this. Okay, so here you can see a breakdown on the pie chart here of food production. What it would have taken to grind bread would have been the primary part of a woman's workload during the day, as well as fuel preparation, drink production, and then making other food. And this is a very nice reproduction from Egypt. Well, it's not a reproduction, it's showing what it would look like. It's from ancient Egypt, and you can see a woman on her hands and knees using that grinding stone I was talking about, grinding the bread back and forth, back and forth. So that was thing one that Sarah did. She prepared the bread. Why did she prepare the bread? Because it was a woman's job to prepare the bread. Now, when it came to animals, that was more for the men's side of things. So you can see, then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf and gave it to the servant. Now, the biblical text is also very brief in what it says. So when it gives us extra information, we are to pay attention. So I would ask you, what does it mean to be a tender calf? Any ideas what a tender calf is? Veal, a young calf, something fatty, something delicious. If anyone has gone to a farm, anybody gone to a farm? I know it's LA, a couple people. Okay. The animals that run around in the field are much more lean than animals who are kept in a pen. So animals that would be kept in a pen, like these two that we have on our text here, are different than those who would be running around in the field. So from Jeremiah 46:21, it says, her hired men are like calves of the stall. And Malachi 4:2 says, you shall go out leaping like calves from the stall. Now there's a difference between herds and calves in the stall. So what is a stall-fed calf, and how does this differ from a calf in the field? Yeah. Say that louder. Excellent. I love it. So I'll repeat that for you on Zoom in case you didn't hear it. The answers were that a stall-fed calf has to stand where it was in its poop, which is actually quite important. And B, that a stall-fed calf eats what the farmer gives it, whereas a calf or an animal in the field would eat whatever it has to graze on. So I'm going to show you this picture next here, which is a reconstruction of an ancient Near Eastern house from the Harvard Semitic Museum. And you can see it's not very big at all. So if you complain, if you have to share a room with a brother or a sister, imagine sharing a room with your entire family. These houses here have a bottom floor and most likely a top floor. And you can see the different activities that were taking place. You have weaving and textiles on the top. You might have an area to prepare food on the bottom. You have area for storage. And then over here, they happen to have a lamb, but you could just as well have had a calf inside of your house. So you can see it's kind of penned off here. So you would have an animal living with you, which sounds a little bit maybe strange to us here. But having an animal live with you is actually quite important because of that poop. What do you use to start fires? Animal dung. And so it was probably a smelly situation in the ancient world, not quite as pleasant as you might imagine. So the stall-fed calves were good for creating fuel, but they were also meant for sacrifices, specifically for sacrifices. So when the Bible talks about fatty sacrifices or sacrifices that were shlamim sacrifices for well-being. It talks about the smoke going up and the incense and the smell going up that really made it exciting for, this is what would please God. This is the kind of thing that was being sacrificed, these fatty cows that lived inside your house. Now, cows were expensive. And so people did not do sacrifices all the time. It was a big deal to kill one of the animals that you had been raising and fatting up. So for Abraham to say to these guests, I'm going to prepare this wonderful meal for you, just shows, it's meant to show like what a hospitable person that Abraham was. Okay, we're going to go to our next slide. And we're going to look at child rearing. Now, before we get there, I guess we can pause and ask if anybody has questions. Yeah. Yeah, the eating the milk and meat together, and we have Abraham doing this. A typical Middle Eastern diet has all of these things together, and it's not till later in Leviticus that we get these laws that request us to separate milk and meat. So the rabbis give Abraham a pass because he didn't know the laws of Leviticus quite yet. Judy. Oh, the question was, why do we have milk and meat? Why do we have Abraham preparing a meal that has milk and meat together? Yeah, question. Would they sacrifice a cow after it's fully grown? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, just depending on when they needed the cow. Usually a younger cow was better because it was fattier. If you think of veal and how much people like veal. So, yeah. Question? Sure. So the question was about hospitality. In English, guest and host and ghost are all related. So if there was a notion sort of driving this hospitality that you never knew who you were going to get, and yeah, that's spot on. That's exactly the sort of background and thought that people would have had, that you're not really sure. So we're living in a world where it was believed that spirits were real and that ghosts were real. So you never knew who you were going to get knocking at your door. We see this sort of thing also if you're familiar with the Odyssey and the Iliad in Greek culture as well, hospitality for that exact reason, that you never knew if it was going to be a god visiting your door, a ghost visiting your door, or just your neighbor. Exactly. Yeah. Oh, okay. So the question here is, what was the ability to preserve meat and other parts of the animal that wasn't being used immediately? Most of the time you would use the whole animal right away. And if you were making a sacrificial meal, it would go to the community as a whole. And your community might not have been very big, but they did have the knowledge for salting meat. We see that for preservation, but no refrigeration or anything like that. Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on to our next text, which I will put on the screen here for those of you who are on Zoom. Second. So our next text is, about child rearing. Do we have someone who would like to read this? Who's here?
There. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too." So she named him Simon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons." So he was named Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children.
Plenty of children to have, huh? Of course, Leah does have a couple more kids later. But in this text, what we see here is this one child and then another child and then another child and another child being born. And this text comes from the context of what I like to call baby wars, where Rachel and Leah are going back and forth, trying to have as many children as possible in order that their husband would love them. Now you might think, well, shouldn't he just love them anyways? Like, should he just love them for them? Well, in the ancient world, having children was super duper important. What might you need children for? Ideas? Work, yes. All of the kids are like, work. Exactly, all those chores and things that you need to do, but also help with the family household economic system. So work would definitely be one thing. What else might you need a child for? Sure, you need marriages, and those could be political marriages, either marrying outside of the family or within the family kin group. And here's a fun fact. The best person for you to marry in a society like ancient Israel was your cousin, specifically your mother's cousin, because that kept inheritance, which is another thing you needed children for, that kept the inheritance in the family system. So inheritance, you needed someone to be able to take over your fields, your goods, your money when you died. You also needed someone to carry on your name. What if there wasn't a cousin to marry? Well, you could marry other people. You could look to someone else to marry, but that would be like your first choice. Maybe not your first choice, but your parents' first choice. Yeah. Yes, all right. Someone has studied the ancient world. The question is, aren't there issues when people too closely related to each other get married? And the answer is yes, for sure. And we see all sorts of problems within, especially like the Egyptian dynasties with health problems. But nonetheless, this happened. You know, now we don't really marry our cousins so much anymore, especially in the States. But this was not an uncommon practice. Okay, I'm going to go back here to our screen. I apologize to people online. It keeps going back and forth, but in order for the people who are here in the synagogue to see back and forth, that's what we're doing here. Okay, so the question is, do you think of biblical families as large, medium, or small? Large. Because we have all these stories where they have a lot of children. How many, pop quiz for our B'nai Mitzvah class, how many children did Jacob have? How many sons? 12 sons. Yes, that seems like a rather large family. But maybe that wasn't exactly true. So let's think about this for a moment. If we think about Leah, and she had those 4 children, and we're not accounting for any miscarriages or any child deaths that might have happened. And child death did happen in the ancient world. So in the first week of life, you had a 50% chance of making it. After that, you had another 50% chance of making it until the age of 15. So child death was very real. So once you had that child and the child was born, you wanted to do everything you could to protect it. And breastfeeding was the way that most children were fed. And so there have been studies trying to understand length between children, like how long a woman would have had to be pregnant. And we find that around 2 to 3 years was about average for nursing. So this is a wet nurse contract that comes from ancient Babylonia. And if you're not familiar with a wet nurse, that is when you give, if you yourself can't nurse for any reason, you give your child to another woman who was able to nurse that child for you. Now, why might you not be able to nurse your child? You could be dead. Women died in childbirth. You might also have adopted a child, and so you needed someone to nurse them. Or perhaps you were extremely rich and you wanted to up your chances of having another child a little bit more quickly. And I'll explain that in a second. But this wet nurse contract says these two people gave their son for wet nursing to a third person. And then these other people received the nursing fee for 2 years and they were happy. In the third year, however, they went to court because they didn't receive the wet nursing fee. And then the judges summoned the gods, and apparently the gods said that she should get the fee for the third year. So this was a well-known practice. You would have a contract around it. You would this was like a profession that you could have. So going back to that third thing that I mentioned, which was that women might have someone breastfeed for them so that they could become pregnant quicker. When we think about nursing spans, this slide here has birth intervals for types of breastfeeding in the absence of other contraceptives. So from the Kung hunter-gatherer people in Africa, who nurse their babies frequently for 3 or 4 years, this would mean you would have about 4.1 years to 4.7 years, or you would have 4.1 years before you would have your next child. So if you're breastfeeding, that means you don't have, your body's not able to conceive as easily and have another child quickly. So that would mean every 4 years. So if we think about Leah having 4 children, and we have that in the span of just a few verses, how much is that actually? Who can do the math quick? We're talking 16 years, right? Okay, so we see, however, the Huttiers of North America who nurse on a rigid schedule start giving supplemental food a few months after birth, and therefore interval between when children are born is only 2 years, meaning they have more children. And a woman in the UK who never nursed her babies had a birth interval of 1.3 years. So with high childhood mortality rates, those stats that I just gave you, and this length of breastfeeding, we can think about these ancient texts and our biblical texts and think a little bit more about what it would have been like for those women to give birth. So now I ask you again, were biblical families large, medium, or small? Do the texts actually show us an accurate picture of what life was like in ancient Israel? And the answer, and here this quote comes from a woman called Hilma Grandquist, who is an ethnographer who studied in Palestine in the early 1900s. She says, "I do not wish to go to the opposite extreme and believe that a wife generally had only one son. Yet there are so many important facts indicating that a woman had few children, and that the onus of proof must fall on those who maintain that the ideal aimed at was definitely numerous children." So the ideal is numerous children. "But they must at least explain how it is that such a great difference exists between the ideal and reality, as the latter is expressed in genealogical tables. It is not said that these numbers always correspond to actual conditions, especially those of ancient times. What they say about the patriarchs' ages shows that they were not afraid of big numbers. If the ideal had really been a wife with many children, tradition and history would certainly have preserved the names of especially prolific women." Hilma Grandquist is suggesting that what we see in the biblical text with these women who have a lot of children is that they are the exception that proves the rule. They are the women who have lots of children, so they're remembered. The women who have fewer children, not so much. And again, from Carol Meyer's book that I mentioned earlier, she says a woman would have spent most of her adult life pregnant. As many as 8 pregnancies were needed in order to reach a family size of 2 adults and 3 children who lived to adulthood. Questions? What years for the biblical text? So they're reflecting, what we see is that the agricultural societies that they're reflecting remain relatively the same from the entire Iron Age. So if we're thinking 1200 BCE through 538 BCE, but if you extend a little further backward or a little further forward, these sorts of societies really remain, like we see them, those that Hilma Granquist was studying in early Palestine before it was, before there were like lots of cities and sorts of things. Like these are just traditional societies. So the same sort of socio background that we see in the biblical texts, we're seeing in these modern, what we might say more modern societies as well. Ryan? I think that would, I don't know that the biblical author would want us to think about that, but yes, because they are named and because they are, you know, those 12, part of the 12 sons, like they did live to adulthood, but a woman who had that many children probably also would have had a lot of miscarriages or infant mortalities in between. Yeah. 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 So for those of you on Zoom, the comparison was made to the story of Hannah and Peninnah, with Peninnah having multiple children and Hannah doing everything she could just to have one child. So I should also mention that ancient Near Eastern texts, as well as the biblical texts, have this perception that a woman's womb was closed by default, and it wasn't until the deity opened the womb that you could have a child. So that's a little bit kind of maybe reversed of how we understand things medically today, but that helps explain why women would pray for the gods to give them a child to open their womb, and perhaps give a little background to what Hannah was doing. Okay, we're going to move on to our next text here. Okay, can we do it quick? Because we have 15 minutes and I have 2 more texts. Okay, go for it. So, so the question is, was the first part of the question? So I would say that in the ancient world and in these traditional societies where you also have to imagine that your mother's brother's children might also be from multiple wives. So you could be marrying a cousin, but out a little bit. So if we think of, like Rachel and Leah, both, well, they're sisters, so that doesn't work so well, but how about Sarah and Hagar? And then you might have someone marry Hagar's children, or someone marry Sarah's children. So you're still marrying your mother's cousins on the mother's side, but they could be from multiple wives. So that might have sustained the practice for a little bit longer, and maybe have hedged off some of the birth abnormalities. Yeah. Okay, for religion, we have Genesis 35, 1-5. I think I'm just going to read this one. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go to Bethel and settle there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let us go up to Bethel that I may make an altar." Blah, blah, blah. And then in verse 4, it says, "So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods that they had and the rings that were in their ears." And the question that we might have is, why do Jacob's family have foreign gods, and what did these foreign gods look like? So I'm going to show you a series of slides which might help us understand what these foreign god looks like. This first one is a silver calf that comes from Ashkelon. You can see it's not very big. It's probably like the size of a water bottle. And the calf would be, half the size. And if you recall, the Israelites in the book of Exodus, which we just read recently, have made for themselves a golden calf. And later on, it talks about King Jeroboam in the north having 2 golden calves, one at Dan and one at Bethel. So the question was, what did these calves look like? Were these foreign gods? Were these little gods? Were these big gods? Perhaps this is one of these sorts of foreign gods that Jacob's family was carrying with him. Or perhaps it looked like this. So here we have a mold on the right-hand side that you would pour hot metal into in order to cast a goddess. And this goddess with her headdress here is probably the goddess Astarte, who would have been a female fertility goddess, sort of a mother goddess. So were Jacob's family carrying these with them? Maybe. Or perhaps they were carrying something like this, which again, they're about, I think, 6 to 11 inches tall. And these are called Judean pillar figurines. And based on their stance and their attributes, people think that they were somehow related to fertility and lactation. So were Jacob's wives carrying these around with them in hopes that they would get pregnant? Because we know that we just read they were having sort of baby wars going back and forth, trying to just see who could get pregnant the quickest. So when we hear things like they gave Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and then Jacob hides them under the oak that was near Shechem, we have to imagine them digging a pit and putting all of these sorts of foreign beings that they had with them into the pit in order to move on. So anyways, I just thought that was kind of an interesting, when we think of foreign gods, what do we think of? And so again, these three different possibilities. There's a lot more in the ancient that we find in ancient Israel, but again, we have possibility of a calf, possibility of a molten goddess figurine, or maybe these clay fertility figurines. We're going to move to magic. And we're going to read again from Genesis with Joseph. So how many people have heard of Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat? Yeah. How many people know that Jacob has a magic cup? One person knows Jacob has a magic cup? Okay. Well, then the rest of us can learn about it. Okay. In Genesis 44, Jacob is, this is the point in time in the narrative where Jacob has met his brothers and he wants Benjamin to come back because he wants to meet Benjamin. So his brothers, they are getting ready to go, and Jacob decides to play a little trick on them. So Jacob puts his special silver magic cup into the luggage. And we see here it says that when they'd gone only a short distance from the city, Joseph said to his steward, "Go follow the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, 'Why did you return evil for good? Why have you stolen my silver cup?'" Now, keep in mind, they didn't actually steal it. Joseph put it there. "And then tell them, is it not from this that my Lord drinks? Does he not indeed use it for divination? You have done wrong in doing this." Now, for those of you who can read the Hebrew, what kind of cup is this and what is going on? That verse that's underlined, verse 5, it says, "Halo ze asher yishta Adoni bo, v'hu nachesh yenachesh bo." We translate that as, does he not indeed use it for divination? But the part that I highlighted in yellow, anybody know what a nachash is? It's a snake. So it says literally, is it not the snaky snake in it? Now, what in the world? How did they get to divination? So, any doctors in the house? Anybody know what this is a model of? The liver, yes. Okay. So we'll get to the liver in a minute. So let's unpack what exactly is going on. First of all, do Jews do magic? Yes. Hidden fact. Yes, there's lots of magic in our biblical texts. Lots of magic you're not supposed to do, but there's magic that they do. Deuteronomy 18:10 through 11, which is the last one on your handout. "Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination, anyone who's a cloud reader, an omen reader, who engages in witchcraft, who is a knotter of knot, who asks of the pit or the knowing ones, or who consults the dead." This is my own translation here. Okay. Sacrificing son and daughter through the fire sounds bad, right? We can agree, bad, shouldn't do it. No, okay. Divination. We're going to put that one to the side for a second because we need to ask what that is. How could you do magic by reading in the clouds? Bird patterns or cloud patterns, and then predicting the future. So divination is predicting the future, understanding the will of the gods. Omen reader, and that's where these two livers come in. Remember that calf that we sacrificed? Well, we might take that to our local priest and he might sacrifice it. And then someone asked about, would they use all of it? Well, you would take its liver out and you would see if it had any abnormalities on it. And then you would compare it with, these are omen texts. So you compare it with your like handbook and you'd say, oh, well, in the 4th quadrant, does it have a spot? Or in the 6th quadrant, does it have a brown marking? And you can see here, little, it probably looks like chicken scratch to you all, but this is cuneiform writing, and it would then give the priests who had taken the liver out information that it would offer to the person who had given the sacrifice. Okay, so an omen reader. Witchcraft? Bad. A knotter of knots. Why is that magic? Any Harry Potter fans? No. Binding spells, spells that are bound, that are not, that are the undoable. Who asks of the pit or knowing ones? This is a reference to necromancy. And who consults of the dead? Now we still need to get to our snakes. So in this list in Deuteronomy 18, I have again highlighted the same word that was highlighted in the text in Genesis, this menachesh. And this seems to be something that isn't related exactly. It's not talking about a literal snake, but what happens when you put oil on water? So when you put oil on water, does it mix? No, it's sort of like snakes on the top. So this is an idea where you would, like tea leaves, be able to read the pattern of the oil in the water. And if we go back to Joseph's cup here, his special cup in which he would do this procedure, in which he would divine. Right. I think we have about 2 minutes for questions on those last 2 segments, and then we'll wrap up. Anything about foreign gods or magic? Yeah. Harry Houdini. He was indeed, yes. Any other questions? Yes. I think I missed the first part when the doors were opening. Oh. Yeah, there were quite a few female figurines that were found in Judahite areas and throughout ancient Israel. And they change over time versus whether they were on a plaque, whether they are 3D, whether they are. Oh, the question was Judahite female deities. And do we see them do we see female deities in Judahite areas? And the answer is yes. We see it throughout time. We see them lasting for many, many years. Those ones that I showed you with the rather large breasts, those were very popular for about 200 years throughout the kingdom of Judah. And so those are probably the most well-known ones, but we do see different ones throughout the time period. Let's see. Did we want to take questions? Were there questions from Zoom that we were taking? Okay, great. Okay, so we'll go back here and we will wrap up so that we stay on time. Our essential question was, how can archaeology illuminate the Bible? And what I hope you have taken away from this brief time that we've had together this morning is that knowing about the world in which the Bible was written can help us understand and appreciate the text more. There are so many other different instances that I could have brought to you, but I hope that these maybe whet your appetite for learning a little bit more about archaeology and thinking a little bit deeper about the biblical text. Thank you.
So I want to thank Dr. Garroway for this wonderful presentation. For those of us who are here, we're going to go back in the social hall and continue the discussion, and you can ask questions and have a nosh. For those of you on Zoom, thank you for putting up with some of our technical difficulties. And we hope everyone will be here on the evening of May 7th at 7 o'clock at night, where Dr. Leah Marduk will be talking about what we know about neuroscience and how that impacts free will, with a lovely reception following. And again, we would like to thank the Sinai and Synapses organization for the grant that enabled all of this to happen. Please check out their site. They have some really interesting things on it. So thank you. We're going to conclude this. And I look forward to seeing you at future programs. Thank you.